James Jaws Byrne, Jemmy, as he's known actually to his contemporaries and his family, 77 years of age, he's died this week, and he's certainly left behind a legacy in organised crime. Not something most people would aspire to do, but for a long time, he headed up what was Ireland's first family of crime. And he was there at key moments, and his own family have been central to some of the most standout moments in organised crime over the past 2 decades, we say?
2 decades, absolutely. I mean, even if you go back to his own personal history, he was an associate of Martin the General Cahill, who was the number one criminal of his day and the number one crime story, if you wish. And if you even look at it chronologically in terms of the big impacts in terms of criminality, then his family, some of his family members played a key role in the Crumlin Drimnagh feud. And Jaws Byrne was at least floating around in there, maybe as a patriarchal figure for some of those young criminals, and then all the way up through the rise of the Kinahan cartel and the subsequent rise of the Byrne Organised Crime Group, as it was named by Gardaí.
So he himself, going back as far as we know, was involved in frauds, check frauds, and then most sort of well known for being a fixer if you wanted a fake passport. Jaws Byrne could get you a passport. He was probably the first in this country to use a system where somebody who had never applied for a passport before, perhaps somebody homeless, maybe in a vulnerable position, was asked to apply to get their passport. And of course, then it would be the photograph and the identity would be used. The identity would be used of the real person on the basis that they were unlikely to ever travel because of their circumstances. But of course, those passports were sold into the underworld, where he had connections deep into Dublin's underworld and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, his major conviction really was when he was in 1995, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison after he was found 138 stolen or blank checks were found in his home. They'd been taken during an armed robbery. And he obviously was distributing them. So he was involved in that world of maybe fraud and fixing, as you said, and generating money through these means. But even in prison at the time, he was regarded as being a criminal of note. And I actually spoke to somebody who'd known him around that time and said he was one of these guys who inspired a bit of sort of fear in other prisoners, not necessarily through threats of violence, but very sharp-tongued and kind of a bully boy type. If we look back at those times, in 2002, he became the focus of a major investigation by the Criminal Assets Bureau. At that stage, the level of money taken from some criminals was not huge, but he was hit with a bill of, I think it was something like 400,000 in total by CAB.
In 2002, that was a lot then.
That was an awful lot.
Yeah.
Now, some of that was for unemployment assistance, which he basically got the dole for years. 43,000, I think they took back off him. Even though he'd never, I don't think he'd ever formally worked since 1974, I think I read somewhere. Ultimately, he settled that bill with CAB. I think he paid a lesser amount of something approaching, 200,000 or slightly more. So you're talking about a huge amount of money. CAB obviously serve a bill where they say these are your assets and how do you generate them. It doesn't necessarily prove it to be the proceeds of crime, but they certainly show that you have this amount of money and how did you generate it. And obviously, over the years, Jemmy Byrne really, as he really was known, lived a very luxurious life, didn't he?
And I suppose that's a good point to jump in and jump back a bit, because before we go forward to 2000s, the first decade, the Crumlin Drimnagh Wars and what went on after it, we just go back to, I suppose, the 70s, the early 70s, late 60s, when James Jaws Byrne met and married a woman by the name of Sadie Rowe.
Yeah.
And Sadie Rowe came from a large family from the south inner city who were street traders. And it was always said that she had ambitions and that she saw in Jaws, Jemmy Byrne, this sort of an ability to pull herself out of that sort of street trading. Many of her sisters would be still, certainly some of them have up until recently been still seen out selling flowers on Grafton Street, and the generations that came after them went into that sort of business, a steady and an honest way to make a living. But Sadie was always said to kind of like a fur coat and wanted more out of life. And they moved up to, bought a house together up in Raleigh Square in Crumlin. And they're nice. They're sort of red brick, sort of 1940s houses. And they began to rear their family there. So they had 3 daughters and 3 sons.
Yeah.
I'm going to try this now and see if I can remember. I mean, this is really a testing. So it's Joanne Byrne, who is married to Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, who we'll come on to. There is Maria Johnson. She has never had any sort of involvement in crime, and she is married to a taxi driver. Very close family now. And the third sister is Melanie, and she remained living in a property just beside that Raleigh Square family home. Probably still is there. It was certainly one of the properties that was mentioned in a second Criminal Assets Bureau case against them in more recent times. And of the brothers, there was James Jr., and then there was Liam Byrne and the late David Byrne, who of course was murdered at the Regency Hotel. So the family moved up to Crumlin, but on the Rowe side, so on their mother's side, there was, a pile of cousins, and a lot of them were sort of living either between Crumlin or the South Inner City area. A lot of them were very close in age, and they became a kind of a gang, a family gang. There was outsiders included as well. But as they came of age, the sons certainly of James Jaws Byrne, certainly Liam and David, formed together into a grouping who, by the age of 16, 17, were drug dealing.
Yes, and were very, very feared. Liam Byrne, ultimately in about, I think, 2002, he would go to prison, be given a 4-year sentence for beating up a guy outside a chipper one night, where he beat him with a baseball bat. But even in that court case, I think Liam Byrne was 21 at the time it came to court. The guards were describing him as being a very serious, hardened criminal involved with a drugs gang who are heavily involved in all sorts of criminality. And this is back in 2002 when that case did come to court. And ultimately, when he was convicted, we heard from the guards this incredible level of intimidation that the witnesses had gone through, including at one point it being described as where a hitman there was an attempt to hire a hitman associated with Republicans to kill one of the witnesses, and all during this time.
To get him off a 4-year sentence.
Get him off a 4-year sentence.
Like he wasn't exactly facing a murder charge.
No, and in the people who are attending the court included Jaws Byrne. Jaws Byrne was certainly in subsequent interviews, the victim was naming Jaws Byrne as directing some of this campaign of intimidation. And of course, another person who had turned up in court was Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, who'd obviously go on to be one of the most notorious gangland criminals in Irish history, but even then was a figure who inspired great fear on the ground. So that's all 22 years ago.
Yeah.
And there was a constant stream of threats, and far worse at that stage, and nothing changed over the years.
And at that point, of course, Jemmy Byrne's 2 sons, Liam and David, had taken their place on one side of a feuding gang, that childhood teenage gang they sort of were part of, split in the middle. Brian Rattigan and Declan Gavin sort of pitted a war against one another, and they all lined up. And ultimately, their cousin, Fat Freddie Thompson, would take over the Gavin side of it after he was killed. And they, for 10 years, pretty much, for most of that, it was dubbed the Cocaine Wars. There was tit-for-tat killings. Was there 20 people killed in that feud?
I mean, there's a lot of dispute about some of those killings. Were they sub-feuds, or were they people that were killed for other reasons, even though they were associated with those gangs? But exactly, I mean, 20 or 18, the number is sort of incidental because there was so much bloodshed, and there were so many other incidents, non-fatal shootings, intimidation, and went on and on. And of course, Fat Freddy was the figurehead of that gang, I suppose. He was the guy who was making the news in the papers, and he probably was directing a lot of that violence. But I think people would say that behind the scenes, Liam Byrne, in particular, was probably more of the brains of the operation in terms of the drug dealing business as it was going on, underneath the violence, I suppose.
And all the while as this is going on, and as it's petering out towards the 2008, 9, 10 really.
Yeah.
2008, there was quite a few murders in that feud. But all the while, Jemmy Byrne is travelling over and back to Spain.
Yeah.
Where he is meeting with the Kinahan organisation. He's meeting with Christy Kinahan Sr., who's in charge of it at this stage. He's meeting with his son and heir, Daniel Kinahan, who will go on to take over that grouping in a short space of time. He was actually, I think the Sunday World photographed him in about 2008.
Yeah.
Or 2008, 2009, I think, out in Puerto Banús. And you even see from the way he's holding himself from those photographs and from the surveillance, he is the family figurehead, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's in charge. A little bit like Christy Kinahan Sr. and Daniel. He is the Christy Kinahan Sr. and Liam is his Daniel.
Yeah.
David Byrne, who's the other son, is kind of more clownish. He seems to be a bit of fun.
Yeah.
He seems to be not quite as serious maybe as Liam in regard to the business operations of things. Liam is this sort of no smoking, no drinking, clean living guy who's very focused on his career and where it's going.
Yeah, I mean, they're spending a large portion of their time over in Spain in the late part of the noughties. They're not just in there and out. They're living there for periods of time. As you say, we pictured Jaws Byrne meeting with Fatso Mitchell, who then was a significant player. Probably what was going on at that stage was, although the Kinahans and the Byrnes were absolutely, close friends and interacting all the time and doing business, they were probably a more separate organisation than they ultimately would become. But Thomas Bomber Kavanagh had risen to the top as a significant importer. There was also Jared Hatchett Kavanagh living out in Spain, and who was Bomber's cousin, and they were all in that Puerto Banús port where people were. I think they were kind of consortiums of drug dealers coming together and, pooling profits and arranging shipments, getting them into Spain and moving them around Europe. The Kinahans were certainly the biggest, but they weren't yet the monsters that they would become, where they would dwarf all others really on the continent. And
by about really 2013, 2014, in the aftermath of the first attempt to topple the Kinahan organisation, the Operation Shovel, they're back up and running in Spain. There's a lot of money being made.
There's a lot.
I mean, we could see for ourselves how the Byrne brothers were driving around this city, how they were behaving. There was cars coming in. Bomber Kavanagh was bringing in cars, 200, 300,000 euros worth of a car, driving home, laden down with gifts for the family. This was their kind of gold rush time.
Yeah.
I suppose between 2000 and until the dismantling process began. But they had this, and again with Jaws regularly in the company of his sons, David or Liam, they had this attitude. It had obviously always been there, but it became very apparent that they were scared of nobody.
Yeah.
They felt untouchable. Despite the fact that, as you point out, he's been hit by the cab in 2002, they don't care. They're building up some assets in the background. They believe that they have a functioning money laundering system through the car industry, that they're making legitimate funds and, come and get us, have a go. Wasn't that the attitude that they had?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Liam Byrne was a registered director of a car company with Sean McGovern, as was Thomas Bomber Kavanagh in the UK. So I think they felt they had a scheme for laundering the money. They were also very public. I mean, we have a picture of Daniel Kinahan at a fight night in the Tree Arena or at Point Depot or whatever it was at that stage, and there's a photo of Daniel Kinahan sitting beside Jaws Byrne and Liam Byrne. right in the front row of the boxing, and just behind them.
What year was that? 2014?
Yeah, it's 2014, and in the row behind
Is
them.
the monk.
Well, it's actually, I don't think we have the monk. I have seen there is a picture of that, but behind him is Sean McGovern
Right.
and the other lesser lights. But Jaws Byrne is up there right next to Daniel Kinahan. And that was his...
And see, that means something. That's not just where people take their seats.
No.
In that world, that is very much this what I'm talking about when you see the surveillance in Spain, when you see how he's been spoken to. You can take pieces of intelligence from that world about where people sit in cars.
Yeah.
Who's in the front seat, who's driving, and the reverence that people hold them in. So Jaws Byrne to be sitting there beside Daniel Kinahan at that time shows that he is the head of that.
I mean, if you think back to it, it was on TV. I can't remember what TV it is. We have a screenshot. Somebody paused it, and we took a picture of it, and you can actually see the little pause button at the bottom. It was on TV. These guys were, on a national TV channel. I mean, incredible, really. And I think one of the other people in the front is a guy, Morris Sines, who was also a big associate of the Byrnes, not to get back into his
the UK,
history.
yeah.
So you can see the prominence of them. And even at the funeral of David Byrne, you can see how that ranking system matters.
And of course, then as well, they were spending. There has been properties identified in Calador in Mallorca, very exclusive part of Mallorca where the Byrnes holidayed because Bomber Kavanagh himself owned one of those properties. But they, as a family, always travelled to Cancun, think Christmas time or whatever, and they went en masse, and there was a huge amount of money dropped for those holidays. Bomber Kavanagh himself, when it was his wife Joanne Byrne's 40th birthday, she brought 20 odd guests to Vegas, and they stayed at the Wynn Hotel and travelled, top of the bus and everything. So the spend was phenomenal, and they really got into that lifestyle. If Sadie Byrne had always dreamed of a fur coat, she'd got it at that stage with her marriage to Jaws.
Yeah, I mean, in one of the occasions which will ultimately go into that cab case, you had Jaws Byrne reapplying a Rolex watch worth 40 grand was taken off him, and he reapplies to get it back off cab. So that's the kind of thing. He was a guy probably in his 60s at that stage, but was still going around with these fancy Rolex watches.
Yeah.
So money certainly at that point was a golden era, and they seemed untouchable. They obviously felt untouchable. They also had this network, not just in Dublin, but certainly across the country, but particularly in sort of West Dublin, they became the absolute unquestionable force. Huge amount of money, a very tight network of people working for them that they probably felt they could trust, and ultimately they were, at that point they were at their peak, and certainly didn't seem there would be anything to touch them.
Yeah. Until fast forward to February 2016 and David Byrne and Liam and other cousins and wider family are at the Regency Hotel where there's a boxing weigh-in, and the hitmen come for Daniel Kinahan. He escapes, and David Byrne is now very famously shot in the reception of the hotel, sparking this horrendous feud. But going back to that actual day when that happened, Liam Byrne, his brother, is there. His body's inside in reception. I think we had a photograph of Liam Bop Rowe, who's recently died as well, another associate of theirs, and a nephew of Jemmy Byrne's, a cousin of Liam and David's. They're there. The police arrive. They ask to try and take statements. I think they're told to fuck off. There's nobody going to give them any help. You can see in those photographs, in those sort of moments and hours after David Byrne, the ferocity in the faces of the likes of Liam Byrne and his cousin Liam Bop Rowe and others. Later during that day, James Jaws Jemmy Byrne arrives back out to the hotel, which is now a crime scene, and demands his son's car.
Yeah.
His BMW, David Byrne, his dead son's car, the car that he's driven out. And of course, he's not given it because it's part of the investigation. And that evening, the family and the cartel begin to gather at the Raleigh Square house, bought all those years previous as the family home. And as the days go on and a funeral has been arranged, they are gathering and they are plotting a revenge, which is like something we have never seen before.
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's a number of people who played a role in what was to follow, but Jemmy Byrne, by all accounts, played a role as well. He played a role no doubt he was a grieving father and the terrible grief that it must cause to have your son murdered like that. But he was also playing a role in seeking revenge. There was obviously a number of elaborate plots that occurred, and it is believed that Jaws Byrne, if not directing them in the very specifics, was certainly sanctioning them and calling for them to happen.
I mean, look, to say it as plain as possible, as they gathered to mourn David Byrne, they were plotting murder, or certainly he is one of those that is suspected of being directing murder, direct revenge. And of course, by the Monday, the Regency Hotel happened on a Friday. By the Monday, Jerry the Monk Hutch's brother, Eddie, was shot dead at the door of his house in the south inner city, or the north inner city rather. One of the first of multiple family murders from that side, and other plots were made. But you see, I covered that Thomas Bomber Kavanagh trial a couple of years ago in the UK, and a lot of the evidence related to that timeline.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you put together a timeline for yourself, you can really see a clear picture. But in particular, the warehouse that he was hiring out there, because he had a new scheme of bringing drugs through to the UK from Belgium and money back out in these, containers, these steel containers that were X-ray proof and whatever else. And he had set up sort of companies, mirrored companies, and was getting this premises ready for the drugs to arrive. But when I look at the lease that's been signed on that premises, it's a few weeks after this.
Yeah,
it's almost happening as they're burying David Byrne in this mafia-style funeral. And then before the end of the year, we have a photograph of Jemmy Byrne out celebrating with Bomber Kavanagh and his grouping, because they have got that first shipment through, which has made them 20 million. So it was like business was never dropped. They never dropped the ball on business. There was a ruthlessness there, even in their grief and their mourning. Business was being done by Jemmy Byrne and others that night. The business of murder was being planned as he was preparing to bury his son.
I mean, it's interesting, actually, if you remember during the Regency trial when we were both there and heard the tapes where Jonathan Dowdall and Jerry Hutch have this long conversation, and it's at times they talk about the feud and the people involved in the feud. You know, there's various things said about Bomber, about, Bomber's wife, Jemmy's daughter, Joanne. But at another point, Hutch is discussing with Dowdall, bringing the feud to an end, or how it could come to an end. And very interestingly, he says it's going to be Jemmy Byrne's decision. If peace, that's what Hutch says to Jonathan Dowdall. Like, he is the man that Hutch says would have to, if there was peace to be had, he would have to
broker it.
Well, it's not that he'd have to broker it.
Rubber stamp it.
Peace couldn't be made without Jemmy Byrne agreeing to it. So it wasn't a decision solely of Daniel Kinahan or even Thomas Bomber Kavanagh. If Jemmy Byrne wasn't on board, it wasn't going to happen. And then he said, Dowdall then asked him how that would happen, and he says, well, you'd have to be saying to him, well, it'd be like, do you want to lose another son, Jemmy? That's what would have to do it. But Jemmy Byrne is still that patriarchal figure. He's still that person that has to okay any deal and has the authority and the sway to say no deal is going to be done unless he's involved.
And of course, he had a very close relationship with his son-in-law, Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, who's now in jail in the UK and facing more charges relating to firearms. But he's a very powerful figure, Kavanagh. It's his people that are behind those actual plots to kill here in Ireland. Daniel Kinahan may be directing them, but he's the one who's providing the manpower, the guns, and actually the nuts and bolts of those plots. And of course, at one point he brings in Imre Arakas, a Lithuanian hitman, in an effort to kill James Mago Gately. But Jemmy Byrne is the man on the ground. He never leaves this country. He never travels, we don't believe, back to Spain, or he's not over and back to Dubai. He's sort of remaining here in the family home. Of course, his health starts to falter. And the Gardaí and the state, in the immediate aftermath of the Regency Hotel, go full force for that Byrne organisation, for his grouping, because they're here in Ireland, because there are assets to seize, and because there are people to surveil and arrest.
Yeah, because I mean, the Byrne organised crime group, which kept its roots in Ireland, as you said, it had registered companies, assets, homes, became a target, and the CAB really rolled them over the space of a year. A sort of deeply forensic, methodical process where, you know, everything that they'd ever really spent over a 20-year period was gone through. And ultimately, the cases weren't even fought because it was sort of unarguable. Now, Jaws Byrne was named as one of the respondents in this case. At this stage, his health had started to decline. Look, the family had been through a lot. They'd lost a son in such circumstances. They presumably had fears for their own life and fears for the lives of other people around them. When the CAB brought the case to court, they described James Byrne Jaws Byrne as not being a member of the Byrne organised crime group, but they said he was somebody who was closely related and involved in money laundering. That's how it was described by CAB. And he said...
So they said he wasn't?
They said they weren't members of the Byrne organised crime group.
Jaws Byrne.
Jaws Byrne. So what they're saying really...
So Jaws Byrne has at this point, in other words, handed over the Byrne organised crime grouping to his son Liam.
Yeah, they say they're closely related and involved in money laundering, and they have access to the proceeds of crime. So they're talking about Jaws Byrne and some of his relatives. So at this point, he's become a patriarchal figure. Rather than becoming somebody that's involved in the day-to-day operation of an organised crime group, he's somebody that is living, that has access to the funds of it, the massive funds, but isn't doing the day-to-day business.
He's mentoring. Usually in organised crime, you do retire probably around, 60?
Well, he's at this point, you know, he died, so it's 8-9 years ago, so he's in his late 60s and his health has declined. So, but what you do have exactly...
Your pension scheme then is...
I suppose so.
Actually, he's looking attractive all of a sudden,
yeah,
isn't it?
Because what happens in organised crime groups is that people reach a certain level and they're not going to be involved in you know, meeting people, collecting money, which is the nuts and bolts of the operation. Now, at this stage, simultaneously, what's going on is the legal process and the investigation into the Regency Hotel murder. Ultimately, Patrick Hutch Jr. would be charged, brought to court, charged with the murder of David Byrne. That case will come to court.
Was that 2018 that happened? I think
that he was charged. I think it was 2018.
Yeah.
And then...
It's like... Do you remember that?
Well, I do.
Court case. Do you remember the divide? There was actually like the Garda riot squad down the middle of a court. And the first time the court was surrounded with security, there was this great fear because tensions were still so high at that time that you'd have the Byrne organised crime group and family on one side, and that you'd have the Hutch. It was like this nightmare scenario for the police because people were still being killed at this stage. There was no abatement to this feud between...
No, I mean, it was really tense. And as I said, the CAB case is floating along in the middle of all that as well. And there's court hearings in other court buildings, but it's still floating along. Some people are fleeing the country, you know, all sorts of, you know, there's attempted hits going on in the middle of it. Ultimately, everybody will know Patrick Hutch Jr., the son of Patsy Hutch, Jerry Hutch's brother, will be brought to court. It will be claimed that he was the man in drag that famously pictured by the Sunday World. Ultimately, there will be a tragedy involving the investigating officer, and the case would ultimately collapse and a null prosequi will be entered, meaning that, you know...
Patrick Hutch walked free.
Patrick Hutch walked free. Probably at that point, the tension amongst the Byrne family was as high maybe as in the aftermath of the Regency. They were furious. And look, can we not understand that? I mean, you can understand that that was a difficult moment for them, whatever you feel about it. So when he walked out, Jaws Byrne and Sadie Byrne, who had a lifetime of never interacting with the media at all, ultimately would speak to the press. They went out and protested at some point. Jaws Byrne would speak to a reporter, I think it was Paul Healy from the Star, and he would say, there is no crime gang. Speaking about the Byrne organised crime gang as they're described by Gardaí, we are a family, not a crime family, we're a family. And they would suggest...
Did he say we were a family, not a cartel? And of course, at this point, they have been so synonymously linked. They're being described as a kind of a
wing of the Kinahan cartel.
A wing of the Kinahan cartel. They're seen as their chief operators here in Ireland, and Bomber himself is seen as their number one guy in the UK. So they are part and parcel of the Kinahan organised crime group. That is how they're being described constantly. And this was a reaction to that.
This is a reaction to that. And they'd say, we're not the Kinahans, we're a family. And they've lost a son.
And it felt at that point as if there was certainly whispers from sources in the underworld that there was a rift between the Kinahan grouping and family and the Byrne / Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, because there was a sense from Kavanagh and from the Byrnes that we're being targeted. Why don't they go after the Kinahans? It felt as if they felt they had been left to carry the can here, that all the full force of the state and the Gardaí were on them. Their houses had been raided. There was plenty of people arrested, loads of them in jail at that stage. And there was a frustration. They felt a frustration that, is the state not giving us justice? I think they felt it was a big conspiracy theory. That
they expressed that it was a conspiracy theory and expressed that,
this case collapsing and blah, blah.
And the, allegations about the Hutches, connections with people in the state and the government. We've heard it before. I mean, I think as well the personal dynamic between Liam Byrne and Daniel Kinahan, by all accounts, became really, really bad. There was certainly a falling out of a significant type there.
Can I throw something in there? Because I recall very much that day that they came out and they made statements and they were demanding justice and all the rest of it. And somehow they managed to get in contact with Jim O'Callaghan, the Fianna Fáil TD, who I think was at that point spokesman.
Shadow Justice spokesman, I think, yeah.
So James and Sadie had a meeting with Jim O'Callaghan, and Jim O'Callaghan came out during the day and sort of said that, or he certainly released a statement that the DPP should give them answers as to why this has happened. Yeah. And I, to my shame, my blood boiled. Yeah. And I phoned up Jim O'Callaghan and I said to him, have you any idea who these people are and what they've been doing? The way you don't, you can usually keep a lid on things. I was really, really cross. I just thought, should a politician be speaking out for these people? This is such a serious criminal that is demanding that the DPP is put in front of them to explain when it had pretty much been explained in the court what happened, to an extent. I mean, there had been a tragedy. The senior investigating officer, he could no longer appear at the court. It was in the middle of the case and it was thrown out in a nolle prosequi. But it just shows you how self-righteous they are and how they can get to a politician. They have the ability and the facility to argue their case and to look for help from a state that they deny every aspect of, that they have spent a lifetime fighting against and refusing to be agreeable with the laws the rest of us live under. But the minute something goes wrong, they go to that very place to get justice. Yeah,
look, the mind boggles with some of these political people who release statements, but I mean...
I don't think he knew their background.
No, I don't think he did. But
I think he was very kind of, he was just sort of releasing a statement, literally, and that's what sometimes politicians do, and they just want to get out there first, or they see a story that's flying, so they throw a quote into it, and all of a sudden they're getting some profile out of it.
Look, it was a very tense time, I suppose, if you look back on it.
A tense conversation with me and Jim O'Callaghan. I'm actually embarrassed now when he sees me, I have to say, because it's not my usual style to...
Look, I mean, he'll be okay, I'm sure.
Oh, I'd say he's
sure he's doing okay. But no, look, I mean, you can understand that it was that collapse of that trial was really quite incredible. And subsequently, obviously, we've had Gerry Hutch go on trial and his two co-accused, Paul Murphy and Jason Bonney. But at that point then, in the aftermath of the first of Patrick Hutch Jr. walking free, it really looked like that was the end of the Regency investigation. And that sense of the state don't want to prosecute anybody and they're just letting them away with it, that was felt by the Byrnes, was really, really strong. And of course, it's ultimately the state did pursue and continue to pursue people in connection with the Regency investigation. And we've seen, even as that conspiracy was being spoken about, the painstaking investigation that was going on in the background, where literally every frame of CCTV from hundreds of cameras across the city, there was some guard going through them. Like literally,
never get all those hours back in his life or her life.
So literally, while they were saying the state have collapsed this on purpose,
this was going on.
This was also going on, and of course, ultimately, Gerry Hutch would walk free from court, giving more rise to that feeling. But we were there,
but at that point, they've Gerry Hutch in the dock, and again the family, and of course they are hoping for justice for David Byrne. But the family were depleted. There was no Jaws Byrne at that trial from memory. I don't think he showed up at all. He obviously, his health was...
No, he may have showed up 1 or 2 days.
Did he? Maybe 1 or 2 days at the beginning, but he certainly wasn't there every day. Every day was his wife said he was there and 1 or 2 of her daughters, usually. And of course, at that point, the Byrne, the organisation under him, perhaps he's now a mentor, a money launderer, somebody who's benefiting from the profits of their crime. It's now been run by his son-in-law and his son. All the while, though, that organisation has been dismantled by both the NCA in the UK and the Garda Síochána here. They are a shell. I mean, what is left of the Byrne organised crime group? What is left as the family prepare to bury Jaws Byrne, Jemmy Byrne, of his legacy?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's much left. I mean, certainly in the last, before his arrest, Liam, I believe he was reduced to phoning people up and using his name to try and collect debts to make a bit of cash. Not even necessarily his own debts, trading off his reputation. Google me, wasn't that what was apparently said to somebody? Google me and you find all about me.
Google me.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of where it is. Certainly, if you look back, Jaws Byrne will be buried tomorrow. If you look back 8 years previous, the level, the expense spent on David Byrne's funeral 8 years ago, all of that will be a far different spectacle tomorrow. It'll be much reduced. There'll be a lot of people in prison who won't be able to attend. Some other people have passed away, and there will be other people that were closely lived off the coat trails of the Byrne organised crime group who won't bother now because it simply isn't in their best interest to appear at a funeral. You can often tell something about where people stand by who bothers attending.
Exactly. And of course, it goes on because on Monday, Thomas Bomber Kavanagh and Liam Byrne go on trial in the Old Bailey in London for their roles in this, what do we call it, a gun plot?
Yeah, I mean, it's very confusing.
It's a confusing story, so we'll get on to it next week when we start covering it. I'm going to try and access the court for that and we can, converse about it. But if found guilty or, if a plea deal or whatever, they're looking at Bomber Kavanagh's already doing 20 plus years in jail for drug running and for money laundering.
Yeah.
And it's going to be another 20 if found guilty at least, because it's firearms. And the same for Liam. I mean, Liam Byrne is looking at if found guilty, and of course he is declaring himself innocent of this. There's no massive big hope on the horizon for any of it.
Oh, I mean, I think if you look at Curtis Warren, who we spoke about, Cocky Warren, who was a major league gangster, and you see he's come out of prison now, and the restrictions that the British state have put on him. We spoke about it before, but so Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, when he does come out after serving whatever prison sentence he's going to get, they're going to look for those assets. They're going to say he has to, while he's out on license, which would be for a significant period of time, he won't be able to have a smartphone. He won't be able to have more than €200 in his bank account. It's going to be, there's no retiring into the sun, I don't think. So the Byrne organised crime group had their heyday, and that heyday is well and truly gone.
Okay, Niall, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.